Hi guys, thanks for tuning this episode of Nick Egan Times. We have an awesome guest on this episode. We have Caitlyn Lubas. Caitlyn has become the person she is today through pivotal experiences during her travels to over 70 countries and all seven continents, all during college. Caitlyn is passionate about inspiring young people to prioritize travel and using international experiences to differentiate themselves in the professional realm. In Caitlin's upcoming book, You Are Where You Go, published December 2021, Caitlyn shares stories of the pivotal moments and experiences from around the world that shaped her perspectives and life philosophy. Welcome, Caitlyn, and thanks for joining my podcast.
Me.
You're welcome. How's it all going over there?
I'm good. I'm calling in from San Francisco. It is beautiful outside today, and yeah, things are great.
It's coming the summer there. You're very lucky.
Yeah, I
How's
know
life
you guys
been?
are on that opposite.
I know we're going into winter. It's going to get cold. How has life been through the pandemic and since it begun for you?
Oh, the pandemic has been so interesting. For me, I mean, my pandemic story in places the pandemic kind of like shit started hitting the fan and everyone started like saying international travel had to end, everyone had to go home. And I was on a houseboat in Zimbabwe when I just kind of finally got Wi-Fi for the first time in a while and then figured out like, okay, Europe is shutting down, the US is shutting down. I should probably try to figure out a way to get home soon. So I feel like I might win like the moment start.
Yeah, 100%. That's crazy. Tell me about growing up and your life, how it's all begun for you.
Yeah. I've always traveling from like a very young age. My parents were always trying to get me exposed to new places when I was little, like Niagara Falls and like New Orleans, even when I was a baby. And like, I don't remember those places, but I think I was really into traveling. But my grandpa operated at sales, but he worked for a travel agency of sorts. So when my dad, an only child, like Acapulco and like Morocco, my dad said all these crazy stories like, yeah, that one time when I was eating monkey brain in Morocco, and I really was just at a young age kind of crazy stuff like that and just get out of my own little small town in suburban New Jersey and really just see the world and see all these different foods and people and cultures. And I think it really is so true that you can only really imagine yourself doing things that you have been exposed to. So I think me hearing all these kind of wild travel stories from my dad at a very early age helped me kind of see myself in the future being able to travel a lot. And my mom is from the Philippines. Like she immigrated was quite young. I want to say like 13 or so. So even just the fact that like another side of the world and like I have family on the other side of the world, that was always kind of like in the back of my mind growing up. So I think travel has been inherently been interested in. Just even as early as high school when I was really just for university. Totally prioritize any place that would allow me to study abroad, first of all, but then extra points for any school that would let me study abroad more than once, which is kind of what led me to go to school at New York City, which is based in New York City, but actually has, I think it's 13 different campuses around the world. So there's like NYU Florence, NYU Abu Dhabi, NYU Sydney. And that school was really one of the big gateways that allowed me to start traveling in college.
Wow, that's amazing. Um, what's the best country you've been to? Tell me about tell me all about all the countries you've been to. Tell me about the whole stories and stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, let me start at the beginning, I guess. So the first really big trip that I took in college was in my spring semester of my first year of college. I took a class that had to do with social entrepreneurship and kind of learning how to build sustainable businesses. And for that class, we were working with a village in Ghana called Weje Chachwe. And it was kind of this village that my two professors who led the class had a long-standing relationship with for like the last few years. The class would always continually work with and help develop this same village. And kind of the main insight that had sparked the creation of this course and this partnership was the fact that in this village in Ghana, there were a lot of women who were just generally like sitting around under a tree all day, like just waiting for their husbands to get back from fishing or kind of like procuring value for their family. And the women weren't actively doing anything. So what my professors kind of realized was we can take all these insights from students in the US who study business, which is what I studied. I studied marketing and global business. We can take these insights and this knowledge from our students and use it to actually help these women actually figure out like, how do we turn our free time into like a skill or a passion that we can be able to actually develop an economy in our local village? So that was kind of the premise of the class, was my first real interaction with like working with people internationally. And kind of the way the class worked was in the beginning of the semester, we had like a Skype call initially with the village and all the women and kind of getting to know them and getting to understand their goals. And the project that they had been working on at the time was around kind of this traditional Ghanaian fabric printing technique called like batik. And it's like you have these cute little stamps that are all different with one color and put them on a piece of fabric that color, and it makes these gorgeous kind of very unique African or Ghanaian designs. So we were working with these women to kind of decide how can we take this general like practice and artwork of making batik fabrics and turn it into a business that you can actually make money off of and like support your families off of. So me as a freshman, not really knowing too much about anything at the time, but really just learning through experience, I was able to develop some sort of like plan during the beginning of the semester. And then we actually traveled to Ghana during the spring break of my freshman year and got to work with these women in person, got to see how they make this batik fabric making process in person. We got to actually do some more like almost humanitarian work as well, where we were helping them to build a school and like build a clean water well. And it was such an impactful experience. And I think the fact that it was in a country like Ghana, which was never really on my radar in the first place, I never imagined myself being able to travel there because I just didn't know too much about Africa, didn't know too much about traveling there, especially. The fact that I was there and I was only 18 and I was like waking up in a mud hut in the middle of Africa, it really was inspiring to me that like, if I can get here, I can get anywhere. And if I learned so much here, I can also learn a ton anywhere else that I go. So it was like at that moment on that trip during my first year of college that I decided, set a goal for myself, a very ambitious goal that I wanted to travel to all 7 continents by the end of the next 3 years before I graduated college.
Wow, that's inspirational in itself, and that's amazing. How did that journey happen? And yeah, talk me through that.
Yeah, so kind of I'll take you step by step through each of the places I got to go. So after I got back from that trip to Ghana, I finished up my semester in New York, which is where my school was based. But then in the first semester of my second year of college, I was able to study abroad at NYU Florence. So it was New York University's campus in the city of Florence in Italy. And that was really my first time being very far away from home. Like I grew up in New Jersey, which is right next to New York City. So even when I went to college, it didn't feel like too much of a stretch. But now I was across the ocean, like very far from my family, being in a 7-hour time difference for the first time. And just kind of dealing with all that was definitely daunting at first. But as I kind of settled in and figured out like all the exciting things I could be doing while I was studying abroad, I really started to take advantage of that. And I kind of went into the semester with this mindset of, I want to be able to travel as much as possible because I know from my experience in Ghana that I was able to learn a lot through traveling. So I kind of made it my priority to optimize my schedule to allow for the most travel time. So I ended up having 3-day weekends, like never had class on Fridays. And then I also only had one class at like 8 a.m. on Wednesdays. So my Wednesdays, every day I would finish up the class, run down to the train station and just take a train to any old like city in Italy where I could just do a solo day by myself, exploring a new city, trying their local foods, learning about the culture, the history. And so those are what my Wednesdays looks like. And then pretty much every week on a Thursday night, it would be me and a couple of my friends who were studying abroad, jetting off to a different country in Europe, whether that was on like a budget airline like Ryanair or on an overnight bus. We use Flixbus a lot. I think one of the key things I learned was just that you can travel around Europe so easily and so cheap. Like one of the cheapest flights I have ever taken was from Milan in Italy to Warsaw in Poland, and it literally only cost $2.
Wow, that is crazy cheap.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. Like, there's this big misconception that I definitely had some degree of this misconception as well, that like you need a ton of money to be able to travel. And if you want to go abroad, you have to have a lot of money to be able to do so. And that's really not the case. I think that's one of the biggest myths that withholds people from even looking into the concept of studying abroad and traveling is they're like, oh, I just like don't have the money. It's only for rich people. And that's definitely not true. Like you definitely can make some personal sacrifices in terms of like you're going to be squishing into a small little airplane seat or like sleeping on an overnight bus or sharing a room with other strangers at a hostel. But if your number one priority is to travel and to learn and to experience things, all of those sacrifices are totally worth it. So that's kind of like what I got out of my first semester in Florence was just, it's so fulfilling to be able to travel and it's so worth making those small sacrifices to be able to travel on a budget. So during that semester, I was able to visit 21 different countries all around Europe.
What was it?
Um, I feel like whenever I get asked this, I usually am torn between either Slovenia or Malta because I kind of like to go for the hidden gems as recommendations because everyone's always gonna like want to go to like Paris and London and all of these classic kind of places. But I love highlighting Slovenia. It was the first solo trip I ever took. I just took an overnight bus by myself, stayed in a hostel by myself for the first time. Ended up taking a tour with like a bunch of other random solo travelers, like to see Lake Bled, which is this amazing, like picturesque fairy tale kind of looking place where it's a super blue lake. There's a little castle in the middle of the lake on a little island. You can take these classic Slovenian boats just to paddle out to that castle in the middle of the lake. And it feels like a fairy tale. It is wonderful. And the food in Slovenia really surprised me and delighted me as well. And then Malta also was another solo trip I took, ironically. But Malta is this tiny little island off the coast of Italy. It is an independent country and it has a really interesting history of like being settled by the British at one point. They developed a really unique language. It's kind of where the name of like Maltesers, like the dogs, came from, this island of Malta. And there's 3 little islands that comprise the country of Malta. And you can basically spend a day on each of the islands if you're going for like a short weekend trip and learn a ton, try a ton of different foods. Like one of their specialties is rabbit in Malta, which I had never had before at that point. And all of the water that surrounds the islands of Malta are just, it's so blue. I've never seen water that clear and that blue in my life. So definitely would recommend checking out those 2 spots if they're not already on your travel radar in Europe.
Wow, Malta sounds amazing. Definitely going to go there. I haven't been there personally, so yeah. Tell me about the other continents you've been to. What about the process there?
Yeah. So right after my semester in Florence, which was what I was just talking about, I got accepted to this fellowship in Tel Aviv called TavTech. And it's basically based around like students who are interested in coding and entrepreneurship and just kind of like getting to learn about technology and startups in the context of Tel Aviv, which is kind of known as like the startup nation, where there's a lot of innovation happening. There's tons of startups that start out there. So I was really interested in potentially working for a tech company in the future. So I got into this fellowship and really it was just 5 weeks of living in Tel Aviv and exploring the food scene, exploring the kind of like socio-political scene in terms of like the Arab-Israeli conflict. Learned a lot about not only the technology and entrepreneurship that we were supposed to be learning about, but more broadly about the cultural context of Israel. And I'm a fanatic of Israel. Like I definitely would go back immediately and try all the food again. Like I was the type of person who didn't even like hummus before going to Israel, but then went there and was like, I feel like I've never actually tasted hummus before coming here because it's so good and fresh.
Wow.
Had such an amazing time there too.
Cool. And what about
And then
yeah.
yeah, I'll just keep going. After that, I came back to New York, did my spring semester of my second year of college in New York City. But one of my very best friends at the time, she was studying abroad in Shanghai. So I was able to take a spring break trip to go visit her in Shanghai. And kind of that was the first time I ever really had to deal with the whole process of getting a huge visa to travel. It's kind of difficult to get a visa to go to China, at least coming from the US. You kind of either need to go through like a specific travel agency or go kind of through this long process where you have someone who's based in China who can almost like sponsor you or like put their name on your application to say like they will be staying with you. So I had a friend who was enrolled at NYU Shanghai for full time. Like she was studying there for 4 years, spoke Mandarin, and I was able to stay with her to kind of get my visa application processed. So that was like an interesting experience in itself. And then I was able to visit Shanghai for about a week. Definitely that was at that point the most I had ever felt out of my comfort zone, just not being able to read absolutely anything. Like obviously they don't use Latin letters in China. I could not speak a lick of the language. I tried to learn it, and pretty much all I really retained was that xie xie means thank you, and like miguo ren means American. So those are two useful words I was able to use during my time there. But I definitely really enjoyed that aspect of kind of feeling very outside of my comfort zone and just understanding that like, wow, every single second that I'm in this country, I am just exposing myself to so many new things, learning so much about how different people live their different lives. Like even one of the super interesting things I think about China that I always remember from that trip is kind of like this prevalence of QR codes. That's just not really a thing in the US, but in China, it's so common. Like you'll rent a bike by like scanning a QR code, or you'll pay for your check at a restaurant by scanning a QR code. And they have this app called WeChat where you can send money digitally. And it's very different than anything I had experienced in the other countries I had traveled to at that point. So I felt like that kind of kicked me up from like kind of a novice traveler to more of an advanced one, where I felt more comfortable being in a context where I definitely felt very uncomfortable. And kind of after that trip, I got back to New York, spent a summer in New York, and then was off again to another full semester abroad in Singapore. And that was probably the best time that I've had. Like the best span of 5 months in my life was definitely the 5 months I spent studying abroad in Singapore. I had chosen Singapore as a location to study abroad, basically because it was optimal in the middle of Southeast Asia to be able to hit as many other countries as possible, just to get a little taste of all the different cultures, the different foods, the different languages. I'm kind of in the mindset that yes, it's great to travel and spend a lot of time somewhere. Obviously, getting a super deep immersion is the optimal experience. But if you're on a time crunch, especially like if you're in a situation studying abroad where you just have weekends that are free, I always think it's best to just try to visit as many different places as possible, because it's always better to have like a little bit of a glimpse into a culture rather than have never been there. Like one of my goals in really traveling is not only to like teach myself about different cultures, but to really establish understanding of different cultures, so that when I meet people in the future, if they're from all different countries, my ultimate goal is to be able to like visit every country. And then whenever I meet anyone, I'll be able to say like, hey, I've been to your home country. Like I kind of can relate to you on a bigger level of, I kind of like know what food you grew up with. I know what the context is. I can picture myself there and I can picture you there. And now we're able to connect more easily. So that's a little tangent about just like why I like traveling. Do you have any questions? I'll stop if you have any.
No, that's an amazing story. What was your favorite place in the Asia region?
Yeah. So I ended up visiting, I think it was 16 or 17 countries during that semester. That was a crazy semester too, because I super optimized my schedule and only had classes on 1 day a week. So I went to school from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Wednesdays, basically, or Thursdays, basically no break in between. But then on Thursday night, I could jet off to the airport and basically come back on like Wednesday night or even Thursday morning sometimes. So I took full advantage of these 6 day weekends that I had while studying abroad. And I went to Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, the whole span of Southeast Asia. But I would say it's really hard to choose a favorite, but I think one of the trips that probably stands out in my mind as my favorite is kind of another hidden gem. Laos is probably the country I was least knowledgeable about in Southeast Asia before actually kind of being there. And it was definitely one of the latter ones on my list just because I didn't know much about it. I kind of knew I wanted to get around to visiting it eventually during that semester, but it wasn't a supreme like priority at the beginning. But when I went there, I kind of went into it having no expectations because I didn't know too much about it. Like obviously I had researched kind of where to stay and what to see, but didn't know too much of the context. And when I did arrive there, it just kind of blew my mind how much I loved the place. Like I ended up planning this trip in Laos was planned mostly around one specific experience where we were starting in the town of Luang Prabang, and we were getting on this kind of long wooden slow boat that just sails down the Mekong River. And you start on the Laos side and you end up on the Thailand side. So we took this slow boat for 2 whole days, slept in a village on the side of the river overnight. And then when we woke up in that village, we saw all these elephants right outside our window on the waterfront, just kind of like spraying each other. And it was a super surreal experience of just being that in depth in nature and kind of just, I never expected that was something I'd be able to see and do. And we had an incredible tour guide on that trip. Like she was the woman who was leading this boat trip down the Mekong River. She was a local, had grown up in a mountain village, kind of like taught herself English, talked us through her kind of whole life story of these almost traumatic experiences that could have really ruined her life, but she was able to kind of be resilient and move on from them. And she was super inspiring. Like I friended her on Facebook Messenger, still talk to her to this day. She's awesome. But yeah, I think mostly because of the fact that I didn't expect anything out of Laos, and then the trip was just amazing and beyond my wildest expectations, I would say you should prioritize going to countries that maybe you don't even know anything about, because the things that you don't have a preconceived notion of, oh, this trip is going to be amazing because I've seen so many pictures of it or I've heard so much about it, you end up having like your mind is blown because you don't even know what to expect, and the bar is like raised well beyond your expectations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. Sometimes when you have the least expectations of something, it's truly just blows your mind and makes it more amazing than it is. What
Hmm.
about other places you've been to?
Yeah, so coming up on your home country, after my semester in Singapore, I spent about 2.5 weeks in Australia. And this was kind of my like consolation prize to myself in a way, because originally I really, really wanted to spend a whole semester in Australia. But then I kind of chose Singapore because, like I mentioned before, I wanted to be somewhere that was more centrally located within other countries so I could travel and see more different places. But I told myself, like, if I'm going to Singapore, I end of the semester before I go home for Christmas. So I spent 2.5 weeks in Australia, started out in tropical northern Queensland up by the Great Barrier Reef, got to see the Daintree rainforest, was really awesome, saw like all the crocodiles for the first time, got to go swimming in the Great Barrier Reef, was a super immersive like nature kind of experience up there. And then flew down to Sydney and Melbourne and saw Great Ocean Road and the Sydney Opera House. And I absolutely loved Australia. So you are very lucky to live there.
Thank you. Did you end up going? Did you go to Manly at all? Did you go down to Manly Beach?
Um, I actually did, yeah. So we took the ferry across the harbor to go to Manly. We had gotten a recommendation to go there from someone we met like in a hostel or something. Yeah, we spent an evening in Manly. Didn't get to the beach, but just ended up like getting food there and walking around.
Yeah, sure. That's where I am. So that's all I was saying.
Oh, sweet.
Cool. And the other continents. So are you working on going? Obviously, because of COVID, that's hit. That's changed the dynamics of that. Because, like, I guess going to where the Antarctic or whatever, that is considered another continent as well. So is that something you're actually planning on doing?
No, so I've actually done it already. So yeah, after I finished my semester in Singapore, spent the next year in New York City. Also went to Peru during a spring break trip. Again, it was like with a class where we were paired with a business in Peru. It happened to be a business that made cement, which is super exciting, obviously. We were able to kind of do like social impact consulting for the cement company, kind of figure out how they could integrate their cement offerings with kind of the local population that needed cement to build their homes and kind of like create their own economic opportunities. So that was one of my experiences that involved South America. So that was my sixth continent. And then after I graduated a semester early in December of 2019, kind of explicitly with the goal of I want to graduate early so I have 7 months to travel before I maybe start working next year. I went to Antarctica basically as a graduation present to myself. And it
Wow.
is super expensive, but I had been saving up for it since 3 years ago when I made that decision in Ghana that I needed to get to all seven continents by the time I graduated.
100%. Tell me about it. What was the experience like in Antarctica?
Yeah, so I think it's really funny because every time I talk about Antarctica with people who maybe don't even know that that's a place you can visit, people always ask me like, oh, isn't it just like a floating chunk of ice in the middle of the ocean? Like, why would you want to go there? And my response to that is no, it is a floating chunk of ice full of penguins. Penguins are one of my favorite animals, and I really wanted to go see them in person. Like, I know you can see a certain type of penguin in like the beaches in Melbourne, but I had really wanted to like penguins in their natural habitat where they're like swimming and jumping and all like tons of populations of penguins. So that was one of my motivations, in addition to the fact that I wanted to see all 7 continents, is I love penguins. But even more beyond that, so the way that you get to Antarctica is you basically fly down to the tip of Argentina or Chile. The tip of Argentina and the southernmost city in the world is called Ushuaia. And most of these small boats that take people on tours of Antarctica depart from Ushuaia. It takes you about 2 days to cross the Drake Passage, which is kind of considered the roughest seas in the world. And it is pretty rough. Like, even the time that I was on the boat, it took us almost a day and a half to get through the whole Drake Passage, which they said was almost record time, but it felt like a million years to me because I was kind of super feeling the way the boat was rocking like crazy with the waves. And they had told us we got a mild version of it. So I couldn't even imagine what it would actually feel like in the times when there's like 50-foot waves kind of throwing the boat all over the place. But so once you pass the Drake Passage, it's super worth it because you get to spend the next 7 or 8 days going around the Antarctic Peninsula. And kind of the way that worked with the company I went through was called Oceanwide Expeditions. And it's a small boat type of cruise ship thing where there's about you and 100 other passengers. And we were able to stop in a lot of different like landing ports around the Antarctic Peninsula where you could see different landscapes, different colonies of penguins, different seals, different whales. So there's definitely a lot of diversity in the landscape in Antarctica. It's definitely not just a pile of snow.
Yeah, that sounds like it. Tell me about your home country. Do you like traveling domestically?
Yeah, no. So I think that's an interesting question that I've definitely evolved my opinion on during the pandemic. I would say kind of in the past 3 years when I was doing all of this international traveling, I pretty much never took a trip within the US besides just like if I was working in California one summer, I was living in California and doing like day trips around California, but I never would really make an effort to say like, oh, instead of going to France for a vacation, I'll just go to like Arizona or something in the US. But I think I've definitely changed my opinion on that in the past couple of months. Like during the pandemic, I mostly was staying at home in my hometown in New Jersey for the longest time, most of 2020. But then I kind of got together with some friends. We all decided, like, if we're able to travel within the borders of our own country, we should go and explore all of the national parks that the US has. And national parks are an interesting topic for me because I remember when I was maybe like 12 or 13 or so, my parents took me to the Grand Canyon for the first time, and that was the first national park within the US that I had been to. But I remember thinking at the time, like, why would anyone want to go to a national park? Like, that's not that interesting. It's just nature. Like, you're not seeing interesting cultures. You're not trying different foods. I didn't like quite get the point back then. And I definitely was not really a big hiker or anything back then. But I think in the recent years, I've really evolved my relationship and my appreciation for nature. And definitely now I am a huge fan of the national park system in the US. Like we have such a diverse array of different landscapes because our country's so big and we have so many different climates. In the past year, I think I've been to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to say it's maybe 7 or 8 different national parks in the past 5 months. And it's been amazing to really explore the US through all of these different places. Like I had been to many different cities in the US prior to that, but getting to really see the natural part of the country has been really awesome as well.
Wow, great insights, that's for sure. What
Thank
is
you.
out of all the stories, all the traveling you've done, what is the number one story you can share?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think I've definitely learned different things in all the different trips that I've gone on. So I would say It kind of depends. I think one of the most impactful experiences I had probably was going to Singapore as an exchange student for the first time. Because up until that point, I had definitely traveled a lot. I'd been to a lot of different countries, but I had been traveling with Americans. Like my friends were Americans, or like with my parents who were Americans. And when I was in Singapore, I was the only American in the room for probably the first time in my life, because this was an exchange program. And I was the only student from my university who was there. I was in a large exchange student group with almost 2,000 other exchange students from all over Australia, all over Europe, all over Latin America, South America, Africa, Asia. Big, big mix of different cultures. And we all kind of were united by this common interest in wanting to spend a semester abroad in Singapore. So we all had this like pretty solid common thread that made it really easy to make friends with different people and just kind of pop into our Facebook group and say, hey, like I'm going to Cambodia this upcoming weekend. Who doesn't have class and who wants to come with me? And it didn't really matter that you didn't like know these people necessarily before you all booked flights to go to a foreign country together. That's just kind of the way how it worked with this exchange student group, because everyone was similar enough to each other with this common interest in wanting to travel, wanting to spend a semester in a foreign country, kind of like probably as one of the only people from their hometown or their home university who were there. So this kind of common mindset of like, we are all very willing to put ourselves out of our comfort zone made me form super, super strong friendships there. Like one of the girls that I've spent the last 3 months living with was actually someone that I met during my semester abroad in Singapore. And it's really, really ironic because she's from New Jersey as well, like the same state that I grew up in, but we happened to meet each other on the exact opposite side of the world in Singapore while traveling. And that kind of bond is just something you can't replicate anywhere else. And it's really made me realize that I think there's this saying that like, your vibe attracts your tribe. And it's like, if you're an adventurous person and you want to put yourself out into areas where you're definitely well outside your comfort zone, you're probably going to find people who are doing the same thing and you're probably going to get along really well with them.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with you. Spot on. Aside from traveling, what other hobbies and passions do you like to do as well? Like, what else?
Yeah. So music is one of my really big passions. I'm a huge, huge concert goer. I think I went to my first concert when I was 8 years old. I saw Hannah Montana back before she was really like Miley Cyrus. And I was just so taken away and kind of inspired by the fact that when you're at a concert, there are so many other people who you have no idea who they are, but you are just all singing the same lyrics. And there's something really, really magical about that sense of unity that I think even at a super young age, like 8 years old, I really recognize the power in that sense of community and that sense of like oneness when you're all in the same room, kind of there for the same purpose of just loving music. And music has such an inherent like way to intertwine with not only your personality, but like your life experiences. Because I think every song for every different person means something different, reminds you of someone, reminds you of something, or has like helped you through a difficult time. So music is definitely something I'm really, really passionate about. And I think it's been a fun thing to kind of integrate with my love for travel because I've been able to go to music festivals all around the world. Like going to, I think my first international festival I went to in Hong Kong and was able to kind of see how like the crowds are different in Hong Kong. And does that cultural context kind of like affect the way people go to concerts differently? Like what are the types of artists that perform there? Like do American artists who perform in Hong Kong kind of like treat the crowd differently in Hong Kong than they would maybe in the US? And just getting to explore the music scene and realize how music is this universal language. Like I think it's more common that people are like, yeah, smiling's a universal language or like crying is a universal language, but so is music. Like it always astounds me that in other countries, when you go to a concert, the singers are still performing in English most times because English in America and even the UK has really just this grasp on like the global music scene. But yeah, like you don't even have to understand the lyrics to music. You just need to feel it in your body and feel it in your soul. And I think that's something super powerful. So I love music. That is definitely a passion of mine.
Sure, that's amazing. What inspires you daily?
I'm super inspired by just like the power of human connection, honestly. Like I absolutely love meeting new people and talking to new people and just like sharing ideas. And I think that's also one of the reasons I love traveling is because you get to meet so many new people from different places who have experienced super different things than you. And just sharing all of those experiences is so powerful. Like I can think of so many conversations in my life, like throughout the past couple of years, where someone has said something just so unique and powerful and interesting that like I have all these sound bites in my head of people saying different insightful things from different conversations throughout the years. And I think the more inputs you take in, like the more people you talk to, the more different ideas you've exposed yourself to, the more you have kind of like all these different factors and ideas to work with. One of my favorite definitions, what is innovation, is just like taking them together before and putting them together for the first time. And the best way to do so you have a ton of different things in your head you could potentially mash together in interesting ways. And that's kind of like how you get creativity and things like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Caitlin, thanks for joining my podcast. You're an extremely intelligent young lady. It's amazing all the things you're doing, the trajectory you're on, the book, just hearing your stories. Yeah, it's mind blowing personally. So, yeah, yeah, you're doing amazing things. Trajectory in life is just gonna propel you to such amazing places. So, thank you for coming on my podcast and sharing all your stories.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I love sharing stories. It's why I wrote a book. And I mean, if
Yeah.
anyone who's listening is interested in kind of following along on the journey, I'm really trying to be like transparent about the way that I'm writing my book too. So if you are interested in kind of like what is the publishing process, like what is the writing process, I try to kind of update on my Instagram, which is at You Are Where You. I also have a mailing list you can sign up for, which is, you can find it at www.youarewhereyougo.com. I'll be sending out this book writing journey. I have my manuscript all done. I'm kind of going through the editing phases, and we'll be designing really soon, getting to move into a copy editing phase, kind of more the marketing phase, which is that I studied marketing and kind of love thinking about how to frame ideas differently. Yeah, I'm super and I'm super happy to connect. Have questions about travel.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. I'll be definitely following you and seeing your journey because, yeah, it's just amazing what you're doing.
Thank you.
No worries. Have a great day.